Join our weekly Arabic lessons on the Discord server. This will be perfect for beginners and new reverts, taught by an Arabic expert who is an Ustad. You'll also get access to detailed notes on the early church fathers, refutations, and answers to all your questions directly to myself. It's just $10 a month on the Patreon.
Alright guys, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I'm joined together today with Brother Leafy. We've had this idea of making this video for a while now, and we just got to today doing this video that we've had planned for so long. And this video's topic is going to be on what did Yasir Qadhi actually mean, and one of the most prominent timestamps within the discussion he had, which when he discusses that we can only go back in academic sense, or we can only go back within that criteria to the tabi'un, so the followers of the companions, and not back to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So we're going to go through why is that the case within the academic perspective compared to the perspective that we have traditionally within the hadith science. We're going to go through their assumptions versus our assumptions. So we're going to compare the two epistemologies, but more than that, we are going to as well be giving some examples of what did he actually mean by this, going through some charts and some scholarly quotes to really help you guys understand what was being discussed there. Because Yasir Qadhi obviously did not give anyone a proper understanding of what he was actually referring to. So, and he allowed obviously Christians and Islamophobes to now just extract that little soundbite and misuse it the same way that he's done in multiple different discussions in the past. Looks like he hasn't learned from his mistakes, but nevertheless, we're going to be clarifying for the layman audience on what did he actually mean and why it doesn't actually pose a problem for us. So yeah, Lifi, assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
So yeah, but if you want to just give us a quick outline of the presentation that you've got ready.
Yeah, so this presentation is just here to explain Isnad Kun matan analysis and the current state of Western academia on the reliability of hadith and what it means for Islam and Muslims. So it's basically here to just correct the misrepresentations that Yasir Qadhi spread out in his interview.
Barakallah feek. So before we actually begin with the presentation, let's see what Yasir Qadhi said verbatim from the video itself.
I'm a little bit pessimistic, and I don't see there to be much of a commonality. So we're going to have to simply say, if you believe in the, that the Sunnah has been preserved by the Hadith, you're going to have to follow a certain epistemology, a certain paradigm. And if you are, like, as you're aware, and you're an academic channel, right? You're well aware. Nobody in the academy affirms the Muslim Sunni science of Hadith. Nobody. It is considered to be completely discredited. I'm just being factual. I'm describing. I'm not, saying which one is right or wrong. I'm just saying the max you'll get, like Harold Motsky and others, are going to say, well, we can say that some Hadith definitely go back to some tabi'un. That's like the max you can say. As for definitively stating that the hadith go back to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, at this stage of my life, I will have to say this is what I say as a believer, not as an academic.
A couple statements there that we can extract. First, we're going to say that we're going to be explaining the two different perspectives, why they have two different perspectives. We're also going to be showing what does he mean by we can only trace back academically to what some tabi'un say and not back to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We're going to go through why is that the case? Is that really a problem, or is it actually due to the methodology you employ? That's why it leads to this sort of roadblock. And is there a good reason to reject traditional hadith methods, or are these just assumptions that they're imposing from flawed assumptions that they have within HCM, which is just the historical critical method? So yeah, Leafy, whenever you're ready, you can start your presentation, inshallah.
Yeah, and we're also going to show Motsky's actual position on hadith, where he does show that some hadith are actually prophetic. All right, guys, so this is the introduction to Isnad Kun matan analysis. Before we understand what Isnad Kun matan analysis is, we first have to understand Schacht's common link theory. So Joseph Schacht was an Orientalist who came up with this common link theory. His idea is very simple. If you have a hadith like this, for example, and you have a bunch of transmitters that all go through a common link, that person who is the common link is the one responsible for fabricating the hadith and ultimately back projecting it to the Prophet. So the common link, the isnad from the common link to the Prophet is fabricated, but everything from the common link to the transmitters is actually authentic, right? So what is Isnad Kun matan analysis? This is a method that seeks to date a hadith by identifying how variation in the matan correlates with variation in the isnad across all versions of that given hadith. So by determining whether a correlation exists between a transmission process and the textual development or the matan of the hadith. It allows the reconstruction of the original version at the time of the common link, and sometimes you can even get further than the common link. You can bypass it. Motzki's method is very simple. The first thing he does is collect all the different variations of the report. So regardless of how weak or strong the individual chains are, he collects all the different variations of the report, all the different matans, all the different isnads, and he graphs them onto a large graph, right? Then what he does is he graphs certain isnad bundles to locate the common links. So he'll notice that certain traditions go back to certain companions or certain tabi'un, and those distinctive sub-traditions carry a similar wording, whereas other sub-traditions will have slightly different wordings, right? Because they're different transmissions. Then he'll lay the matan variants in synoptic commons and look for clusters that match isnad bundles. Then he can test the correlation. So for example, when he sees that certain distinctive wordings is related to distinctive sub-traditions, or certain matan is related to distinctive isnads, he'll see the correlation and he'll be able to reconstruct the earlier version of the hadith up to the common link, and sometimes even through the common link. This is called reconstructing the text. Now, once he can date the report at least to the common link's lifetime, and in many cases, he can even go beyond the common link. The reason why he can only usually get to the common link is because once he reaches the common link here, there's nothing else for him to compare it to, right? So there's no more isnads for him to compare it to. There's no more matan for him to compare it to. So that would be the antiquium, right? That's the point at which we can no longer reconstruct the hadith, and that's where we can date it with certainty. It's possible that it goes sometime before. How much is uncertain, but we don't know. But we don't know how much, for example, it can go beyond the common link. So again, I want to keep in mind that this is a method of dating. It's not a method of authenticating a hadith. Like by itself, this does not authenticate any hadith, and it doesn't attempt to prove prophetic origin. All this method is trying to do is to date traditions and see how far each tradition can be dated with certainty, right? With any degree of probability. So let's look at some examples, and inshallah, this will make a bit more sense. The first example is this hadith with the Prophet and the cat. So this is the isnad of the hadith, and this specific variation is this specific variation is found in the Muwatta of Imam Malik, and it says, quote, once Abu Qatada was visiting her and she poured some water for him to do wudu with. Then just then a cat came to drink from it, so he tilted the vessel towards it to let it drink. Kabsha continued, he saw me looking at him and said, are you surprised, daughter of my brother? I said, yes. He replied that the Messenger of Allah, peace and blessings be upon him, said, cats are not impure. They intermingle with you. Yahya said that Malik said, there is no harm in that unless one sees impurity on the cat's mouth. So this is a normal hadith, a quite mundane hadith, talking about the jurisprudential usages of cats, whether or not they're pure or impure, as opposed to, for example, dogs, which we know are impure. So you'll find this hadith, like I said, in the Muwatta of Imam Malik with this distinctive sub-tradition from Abu Qatada al-Ansari. Now, when we look at the diagrams for this hadith, this is the one that this is the first diagram that Motzki uses. He notes that the common link for this tradition would be Malik bin Anas. So you can see that these are the collectors of hadith. We have Abu Dawood, An-Nisa'i, Ibn Majah, Tirmidhi, and so on. We have the tradents that get to those muhaddithin, and then we have the common link, which would be Malik bin Anas, and then the chain that goes straight to the Prophet. So under the Shakhtiyan paradigm, we would assume that Malik bin Anas is the one who fabricated this hadith, and that this isnad up to the Prophet, right, is fabricated or back projected onto him. It's not an authentic isnad. Motzki doesn't believe Shakht, and he refutes him on this point. He says that Malik bin Anas isn't necessarily the fabricator of the hadith. Instead, he's better seen as someone who widely disseminated, he's better seen as a node of transmission, someone that widely disseminated this hadith or popularized it, not necessarily someone who fabricated the hadith. We have another distinctive sub-tradition that is even more broad. This is the second diagram that Motzki uses, and this is Malik's version of the hadith in the pre-canonical collections. Then we have another distinctive sub-tradition, the Abu Qatada tradition from Ikramah to Yahya bin Abi Kathir to Ma'mar to Abdul Razzaq. This is another distinctive sub-tradition. Keep in mind that all of these different traditions will have slightly different variations in matan because they're narrating with a meaning. They're not narrating verbatim. Right. Finally, we have another distinctive version of this hadith from Abdullah bin Abi Qatada. And you can see that this one is compiled by Ahmad bin Hanbal, Al-Bayhaqi, and Al-Rabi. So So now he has mapped out all these different modes of transmission. He's looked at all the different diagrams and he's compared the different correlations between the mutun and the asanid. What does he conclude? Well, to date the material, he concludes that, quote, apart from the finding that the transmission of the prophetic hadith concerning the cat can be traced back to the last quarter of the 7th century. So what he says is that this hadith can be traced back to the last quarter of the 7th century. It doesn't mean that it originated there necessarily. What it means that is the last place that we can with certainty know that the tradition existed. He goes on to say, quote, the existence of a prophetic hadith concerning the cat allegedly reported by Abu Qatada can only be demonstrated from the generation after the companions. Whether it arose from an original companion tradition about Abu Qatada or from the beginning existed as a prophetic hadith independently of the companion tradition, we cannot answer with certainty on the basis of presently available sources. Meaning that he can no longer reconstruct the tools at his the tools that he's using can no longer reach back in time to further find out, well, does it go back to the prophet, to a companion, or where exactly is the origin of the tradition? It can only reconstruct it to the last quarter of the 1st century, which is at the time of the tabi'un. Now, this is what Yasir Qadhi meant. What he meant to say is that this is the most that we can reconstruct it to, right? And that's fine, that's true. But that doesn't mean that that's when the hadith originated, as Shaykh had falsely assumed. We have another example of this. The next example is the Zakat al-Fitr tradition. Hadith says Allah's Messenger enjoined the payment of Allah's Messenger enjoined the payment of 1 sa of dates or 1 sa of barley as Zakat al-Fitr on every Muslim, slave or free, male or female, old or young, and he ordered that it be paid before the people went out to offer the Eid prayer. And this tradition can be found in Sahih al-Bukhari. Now, we can look at the graphs that Motsky uses for this tradition. We notice that this tradition is found in Muslim, Abu Dawood, and Nisa'i, at-Tirmidhi, and like I said, in Bukhari. And the common link for this tradition is Musa bin Uqba. We can see it right here. So again, under the Shakhtian paradigm, we would assume that Musa bin Uqba is the one who fabricated this hadith and back projected it to the Prophet. Likewise, we have another distinct tradition here where we have it from Layth bin Sa'd, and he also goes through Nafi'. So in both traditions, Nafi' is common to that, and Musa bin Uqba is the partial common link here, and Layth bin Sa'd is the partial common link for this distinctive sub-tradition. Finally, we have another distinctive tradition from Malik bin Anas, and again, the chain goes through Nafi'. So how would skeptical scholars view this tradition? Well, a skeptical scholar like Shaykh or Yumbal would see that all these traditions go through Nafi', so Nafi' is clearly untrustworthy, and he's the one who fabricated this hadith. He's the common link, right? We read, quote, furthermore, Yumbal believes that Nafi' from Ibn Umar, a hadith which was allegedly transmitted by other of Nafi''s pupils, are without exception forgeries, invented by the authors of the canonical collections. But our Isnad Kun meta-analysis of the Zakat al-Fitr tradition succeeded in showing that the majority of the versions of this hadith indeed do go back to the pupils of Nafi' mentioned in the respective asanid. The claim that these versions were constructed and formulated after the model of Malik's matan has proved untenable. Yumbal's conclusions in this article on Nafi' then are generalizations. They are not limited to the analyzed example, the Zakat al-Fitr hadith, but are judgments on all the Nafi' ibn Umar hadith. If we were able to prove Yumbal's conclusion wrong in at least one case, it is also possible to refute his general statements, meaning that Yumbal, or the Shakhtian assumption that Nafi' is the fabricator of the hadith, is incorrect. Yumbal also rejects single strands. So single strands recall hadiths that don't have a common link tradition. They're just single strands. So for example, let's assume there was another narrator here that got this hadith and a single strand. Yumbal rejects them as well. So what does Motsky say about this? On Yumbal's rejection of single strands, Motsky says this is methodologically unjustifiable. Yumbal's hypothesis that the historical credibility of a bundle of tradition increases the more it is integrated in a network is indeed justified, but one cannot move from there to conclude that all strands which are not intertwined in a network should a priori be deemed forgeries until the opposite is proven. This point of view would condemn the majority of early sources for early Islamic history as inauthentic and put them beyond the pale of historians studying the period. And the footnote, he reads, this is a type of e silentio conclusion, so Shakh's famous argument from silence. The fact that one strand consists of several single strands leads to the conclusion that there are no other strands, and this further leads to the conclusion that single strands should be regarded as dives or later forgeries. So he's explaining that this rationale is unjustifiable and methodologically unsound. So to see an example of what I'm talking about, you can look here. So you have, for example, a hadith that looks like this. You have the compilers, the collectors of the hadith. You have the common link of the tradition, the one who popularized it or disseminated it, or according to Shakh, he's the one who forged it. Then you have the people with chains that don't contain the common link. Well, okay, if the common link's the one who forged it, how is it that there are chains that don't have the common link in them? Well, the answer to that from their perspective is, well, these are dives. These are later fabrications. This whole chain is inauthentic, and someone later made it up and back projected it to the Prophet in order to get around the common link, right? And Motsky is refuting this idea, as you can see. Now, what is Yumbol's response to Motsky? Well, he copes by denying that Nafi' even existed. He says, quote, whether or not the first Muslim hadith experts knew or suspected that it was probably not a man called Nafi', the Mawla of Ibn Umar, who taught Malik, but that it was Malik who attributed the Fitr material as well as dozens of others to his alleged master, we have no way of ascertaining. So you can read the rest of it. But in short, he says that Nafi' didn't even exist and that people are just back projecting things onto Nafi' and they were all in on this great plot. On denying Nafi''s existence, Yumbol refutes this. On denying Nafi''s existence, Motsky refutes this as well. He says, quote, but Yumbol uses the biographical sources exclusively to verify his hypothesis. He passes over all the information which might contradict it and interprets all the information he does use in one direction only. Certainly, he does not sufficiently question whether or not other interpretations might also be possible. Yumbol's main arguments against the historical existence of Nafi' are the paucity of information on his life, the contradictory character of the little information that we have, the lack of biography in the early sources, and the difference in age between Nafi' and Malik, who is responsible for the biographical information of Nafi'. Our investigation of these arguments has shown that the first two objections are valid not only in the case of Nafi', but in that of many other personalities of the first and second Islamic centuries, as well as whose historical existence is generally accepted. We even managed to find explanations for these circumstances in Nafi''s biography. We were further able to refute the argument from silence, which inferred the probable non-existence of Nafi' from the lack of a biographical entry on him. The phenomenon can be attributed to a gap in the source, which in the meantime has been closed. Yumbol's arguments directed against the historical authenticity of Malik's claim to be a pupil of Nafi' turned out to be inconclusive and insufficiently supported by the sources. In short, Yumbol's arguments that argue that Nafi' didn't even exist is completely unjustified. Furthermore, we have further evidence that refutes Yumbol's claims. Ibn Ishaq narrates from Nafi' from Ibn Umar in his Sirah. Now, for those of you who know anything about the Sirah literature, you would know that Ibn Ishaq famously hated Malik. They had a bit of a beef. But according to Yumbol, they were all in on the great plot. And you can see the chain here that is quoted from.
Wait, Leafy, can you bring it back to Motsky, the recent quote from Motsky? So, just so I can understand, the fact that there's minimal biographical material and these other points that Yumbol was using, the reason why he doesn't mind for other people but does mind with Nafi is because he needs Nafi to not exist for him to run his point, right?
Yeah.
For those that have minimal biographical material, etc., because he's not of any need to undermine their existence, because to like sort of support his hypothesis, he doesn't mind in granting their existences. So, but it's basically selective skepticism.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And more than that, I think it's the idea that, well, what's the strongest chain according to most Muslims? Most Muslims would just say it's from Malik and Nafi' and Ibn Umar, right? The golden chain. So if he shows that even that, your golden chain is inauthentic, then what does that say about the rest of the hadith literature? I think there's a bit of that going on as well. But you're right, there is selective skepticism going on. And Motsky rightly calls this out. So now we can clearly see the differences in approaches and how that leads to different conclusions. For the Muslim tradition, our default stance towards the tradents is trust. I'm going to trust you until you give me a reason not to trust you. Whereas with the historical critical method, they a priori assume that every person is doubtful. They view everyone with this a priori skepticism, regardless of just before you even look at the sources, you just have to doubt everything, right? This comes from this Humean skepticism background. Secondly, on the role of the companions, as Muslims, we believe that they were the best generation who were morally upright and that they were generally trustworthy. They wouldn't go out of their way to lie about the Prophet, at least not as a whole. You might have one or two companions who acted acted inappropriately, but as a whole, the companions are generally trustworthy and moral and upright. Whereas HCM doesn't view them through this lens. They view them as ordinary actors with ordinary interests. And this is based on the principle of analogy that, for example, that the companions are motivated by the same things that we're motivated by today. So, for example, if today we're motivated by political power, by women, by worldly, what's it called? Hedonism, then likewise the companions were also motivated by the same thing. And then also the view of miracles. So, for example, we see miracles as admissible, as evidence. There's no reason to rule them out a priori. But for HCM, they assume naturalism. So miracles are a priori ruled out. So any reports that contain the Prophet predicting the future or performing miracles or knowing things that he shouldn't know, all of these are seen as embellishments a priori, without even looking at the chain, without looking at anything, right? So these are some of the key methodological differences and approaches that lead Western scholars who are more skeptical to different conclusions than the traditional scholars. In terms of the burden of proof, should reports be attributed to the Prophet be presumed to be authentic until proven otherwise, or should they be presumed to be inauthentic? According to Patricia Crone, her opinion on legal hadith is they must indeed be presumed to be inauthentic. David Powers, however, disagrees. He says, I believe that the onus lies on those who deny the authenticity of reports attributed to the Prophet. And he gives his reasoning. During the past 40 years, Schacht, Spite, Cook, and Crone twice have attempted to prove that 1/3 restrictions could not have been introduced by the Prophet. Crone, however, now rejects Schacht's explanation of the rule, and both she and Cook concede that their joint effort to explain the cultural origins of the limitation was wrong. Furthermore, Crone's most recent attempt to disprove the authenticity of this hadith is at best inconclusive. Viewed against the background of this record, her assertion that reports attributed to the Prophet must indeed be presumed to be inauthentic hardly inspires much confidence. Of course, the debate over authenticity should not be judged solely with reference to this particular report, but until such a time as the skeptics, including myself, have convincingly demonstrated that a significant number of reports attributed to the Prophet are not authentic, the burden of proof should continue to lie on those who deny authenticity, meaning that the track record of the revisionist has not shown with any confidence that a majority or even a lot or even a great deal of reports attributed to the Prophet are inauthentic. And historically, we shouldn't assume that these reports are inauthentic until the person making the claim is able to substantiate that belief. Now, on Schacht's method, this method has been refuted by Motzki most notably, but other scholars have also had a say on Schacht's thesis. Schacht has many contentions, but some of his contentions were that isnads were put together arbitrarily, and these are the scholars who refuted him. For example, Mustafa al-Azami, Zayman, Motzki, Gregory Schuler, and Andreas Gorky. His emphasis on cultural borrowing was refuted by al-Hallaq and William Avi Maghin. His interpretation of common links disagreed upon by Schuler, Motzki, and Gorky, and his claim that family isnads are not reliable, which was refuted by Nadia Abbott, James Robson, and Montgomery Watt, as well as Al-Azami and Motzki. His main thesis that legal hadith dating from the first Islamic century do not exist was rebutted by Coulson, Powers, and Motzki, and Schacht's frequent use of arguments from silence is disagreed upon by Al-Azami and Motzki as well. It can be observed that in spite of all these criticisms, which virtually dismantle his theory piece by piece, Schacht's effect on scholarship is far from abating even today. When Western studies on hadith and Islamic law are read with reference to his thesis, it is nearly impossible not to become aware of this situation. As a matter of fact, several Western scholars, including Motzki, who can be considered Schacht's most important critic, continue to argue, like Noel Coulson, that Schacht's theory is irrefutable in its broad essentials. Continuing on the burden of proof point, many Orientalists are also of the opinion that the burden of proof lies with skeptical scholars. For example, David Power states that until the skeptics have convincingly demonstrated that a significant number of reports attributed to the Prophet are not authentic, the burden of proof should continue to lie on those who deny authenticity, which is what I just quoted. Long before Powers, however, Johann Fuck, in his review of Schacht's Origins of Mohammedan Jurisprudence, criticized the skepticism in the book and pointed out that while extreme skepticism was abandoned in other disciplines, generalizations still exist in Islamic studies. Like Fuck, who, on the basis of Ibn Ishaq's Sirah, objected to Schacht drawing generalizations, Montgomery Watt too argued that the historical material should be accepted as having a solid historical core of fact until a reason is adduced to the contrary, right? In his review of Patricia Crone's Meccan Trade, R.B. Sargent, another scholar of Islamic history, goes beyond what's somewhat blurry classification between historical and legal material, and observes that methodologically we cannot start from a premise that a tradition is a genuine report of fact until it is credibly shown to be false or partially or wholly invalidated by palpable bias. Echoing David Power's view that the burden of proof lies with the skeptical scholars, Motsky also notes that adopting a premise about authenticity or the inauthenticity of traditions is only possible after having dated a large number of hadith, and Western hadith studies have so far not reached a stage allowing its scholars to make these kinds of generalizations. Although he is right about Western hadith studies, it is evident that Muslim scholars hold this privilege, since they analyzed and categorized a hadith based on their methodology, some of whose constituents can be traced to Imam Ash-Shafi'i's Risala. If this methodology is deemed failing, giving rise to the claim that hadith literature should be analyzed anew, then it appears to be obvious who bears the responsibility of proving these claims, which we know the revisionists are the ones who have this burden of proof. In addition, as Sargent rightly puts, the purpose of criticism of sources is to deduce the acceptable data and not to destroy them. Scholars starting from the principle that traditions cannot be accepted scholars who start from the position that traditions cannot be accepted as authentic until the contrary is proven, focus their energy on proving the unreliability of sources, and in doing so neglect to demonstrate how these sources should be rightfully used. Finally, although Christopher Melchurch argues that Al-Azami is a dogmatist, this does not rule out that Schacht was a dogmatist too. He calls Al-Azami a dogmatist because he's a traditional Muslim who defends the traditional ilm al-rijal and the traditional science of hadith. In other words, as Al-Hallaq rightly states, the Orientalist paradigm is no less ideological than Islamic scholarship. The fact that both sides have certain assumptions and premises and take some positions for granted fuels a debate in which scholars are attempting to convince each other. Certainly, it is not the intention of the study to deny the value of this debate or to exclude the possibility that scholars from both sides might set forth some definitive proofs which compel the other camp to accept them. It does imply, however, that a consensus between the two paradigms is not likely, and that the search for a common paradigm is an even pointless task. Therefore, the emergence of a new synthesis or a full-scale paradigm shift in Kuhn's terminology should not be expected. Yet despite all of this, researchers from different scholarly traditions are able to benefit from each other's studies, for in most cases it is possible to separate a scholar's findings from his or her interpretations of those findings. In bearing this separation in mind, Muslim researchers should attempt to find explanations for Orientalist findings according to the classical Islamic paradigm. We should not adopt their paradigm, we should be defending our own. And we've shown that our paradigm is worth defending. These final two quotes were from a paper by, let me just, I'll send you the paper so you can put it on screen later, inshallah. Finally, we have another scholar, Kara, who says, this is what happens when one is inclined to see things in black and white. No one claims that the entire hadith corpus is reliable. As Muslims, we don't claim that the entire hadith corpus is reliable. Motsky, Shula, and Gorke and I agree that some hadiths can be traced back to the Prophet or companions while others cannot, meaning that some hadiths can be traced to the Prophet, contrary to what Yasir Qadhi says, that the most you can get, the max you can get is an attribution to a tabi'i. Motsky actually does believe that some hadith are prophetic. Likewise, so do certain other scholars like Martin van Putten. For example, he believes that the hadith about the 7 modes of recitation of the Quran is authentic. It is prophetic because that's the simplest explanation of the variants in the Quran. And there are other examples like this where certain scholars believe that certain hadith are prophetic. Now, if scholarship cannot reached to the conclusion that a hadith is authentic because they can only date it so far, that should in no way make us uncomfortable with that or make us doubt that tradition. Instead, we should realize that this is just a limitation of the method that they're using. Finally, it's worth pointing out some of the reasons why the traditional ilm al-rijal or the traditional science of hadith is superior to isnad kun matan analysis. First of all, our tradition has already been done. For them to actually do isnad kun matan analysis and to collect and collate all these reports and examine the correlation between each distinctive tradition, that takes a lot of time. And to do that for the entire corpus isn't going to be done for a very, very long time. We have the advantage that our tradition, our method has already been applied. The scholars have already done this work for us. Secondly, our use of biographical reports, the ilm al-rijal literature is very useful, and scholars like Motzki are waking up to its usefulness. Whereas the skeptical scholars really treat it with skepticism and don't really accept it. So, for example, Yumbol will be happy to use the ilm al-rijal literature only when it supports his conclusion that he wants to pedal forward, that someone is the common link or someone is unreliable. He'll disregard the reports that speak favorably about a specific tradent in light of the ones that speak negatively about them. Whereas the traditional muhaddithin would look at both of these reports and weigh them and see, well, who made this claim, why they're making this claim, does it actually have substance? Whereas Yumbol doesn't really think that far ahead. In terms of the correlation between the matan and the isnad, you can find the same thing in the Madar tradition. For example, you can find Ibn Hajar doing a kind of isnad kun matan analysis where he looks at the different narrators and he notices that this addition is because of this narrator, and he's looking at correlations. You don't need to have the proper isnad kun matan analysis in order to notice that the original muhaddithin were doing like the same thing, not at the same level, but they were definitely doing the same thing. We can say that our hadith is also relatively objective. Now, there is bias in every method. Isnad kun matan analysis is not also, it's not an unbiased method. But as far as we can say that the traditional ilm al-rijal was also fairly neutral, because we have examples where critics condemned their own imams when they were trying to compile data by them. For example, Malik's lone narration is declared munkar by later Malikis because it's a lone narration, and we have other narrations that are stronger, that are actually more authentic. Isnad kun matan analysis is a method that is outwardly supposedly neutral, but it depends on the very data that the tradition has produced. And if you say that that data itself is unreliable, then what you're saying is that isnad kun matan analysis is also part of it is unreliable. At least that appeal to the Sunni ilm al-rijal literature is also unreliable. So these are some of the advantages or disadvantages between isnad kun matan analysis and the traditional ilm al-rijal. There's a lot of common overlap between the two, but there's also a lot of fundamental differences that lead to different conclusions. And depending on what approaches and what assumptions you share when approaching the material, that will influence your conclusions about the reliability of the sources. So, in conclusion, every advantage assigned to isnad kun matan analysis, for example, spotting interpolations, mapping variants, dating circulations, was already systematized by early Muslim critics centuries before modern isnad kun matan analysis at a far broader scale. Motzki's work succeeds largely because he stands on the mountain of data whose critics already graded.